Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I'm very happy to be talking with Annie Wertz. Annie is a psychologist. She has her bachelor's and her PhD in psychology from Boston University and University of California, Santa Barbara, respectively. She's done her postdoc research at Yale University. She's currently a research group leader at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development out in Berlin. A lot of her research focuses on infants and young children and their cognitive development. She's studied theory of mind. She's studied many different aspects of cognitive development in infants. And more recently, she has been doing lots of wonderful research on how plants shape the mind, and more specifically, how plants are really impactful in shaping cognition in infants. I was super excited to talk with her. I had been wanting to talk with her about her really fascinating research. We spent almost 2 hours talking about many things. We started by talking about her background and why she studies infant cognition. We talk about infant development overall. I give a little bit of a history of where this kind of stuff originates in a systematic way. Of course, you talk about infant cognition, you're going to talk about Piaget, so we talk a little bit about that. We talk about object permanence and some of the research there. We obviously talk about theory of mind, what that is. And then we talk about the various cognitive domains in which the human mind is kind of split up into and how we evolve and develop. We then talk about her more recent research on plants and the environment. We talk about the different types of plants, such as toxic versus non-toxic. We talk about the coevolution of plants with humans. We talk about how infants are able to discriminate between different types of plants, such as those that are edible or not. We talk about kind of in the details about her plant experiment. So she explains how this was done in their laboratory and how they were doing research on how infants will be able to make certain discriminations between various types of plants and what that means. And then we also talked about some of the cross-cultural differences and some of the research she did in collaboration with other researchers on infant cognition with plants in different parts of the world, and many other topics. I have to say she was quite kind, really wonderful to talk to, and she is just an absolute treasure of information. She has so much information on these topics, and I had an absolutely wonderful time talking with her. And so now I bring you Annie Wertz. I am here with Annie Wertz. Annie, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I'm very excited to talk with you. As I was saying before we hit record, I've seen you present at a conference, and I've read some of your work, and so I'm very excited to talk about your research and what you're doing. So thanks for coming on.
Well, thanks a lot for the invitation. It's a pleasure, and I'm really glad to talk to you.
Yeah, likewise. So for listeners that don't know who you are, just tell us kind of your snapshot of you, what you do, what your background's in, what you currently research, your primary interest areas, all that fun stuff.
Sure. So I am primarily an infant researcher. So my work looks at how babies understand the world around them, and I'm specifically interested in how babies learn about the world from other people. My kind of academic background is I have two kind of pieces to my academic background. One is a cognitive development piece, where I'm looking at the cognitive structures that infants are using to do things. And the other is an evolutionary piece where I'm an evolutionary psychologist. So my work and my interests are informed by thinking about what kinds of problems our species would have encountered over the course of our evolutionary history and how that could have shaped our minds. So kind of putting that all together, I look at how babies learn about plants. So what are the underlying cognitive structures that babies use to learn about these things that are kind of in modern environments, something that don't seem very important. But if you think over evolutionary time, plants are really of fundamental importance to humans. So it's what we were eating. Their plants can be very dangerous. They can kill you. So I'm sure we'll go into more detail, but they're a really fundamental part of human life. So I'm just interested in exploring that. My background is I currently live in Berlin, Germany. I'm working as a research group leader here at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development. And that is the equivalent of roughly an assistant professor position. So I lead my own research group with pre-docs and postdocs and students, really fun international team. And before that, I was a postdoc at Yale in the Infant Cognition Center with Karen Wynn. And before that, I was a graduate student at the University of California, Santa Barbara, under Tamsin German, working in the developmental and evolutionary psychology area.
Oh, it's quite the journey there. It's wonderful. Yeah, it's great. I think the only person I've talked to that is coming to mind at Max Planck is Patrick Roberts, who wrote a fantastic book called Jungle, where it talks about the history of tropical forests. So he goes all the way back, going through all the different periods of the earth and how things developed over time and how we understand all the way up to modern day. And he was brilliant. I mean, he was great. So that's the only person. I may have had somebody else on the podcast that's also at Max Planck. Obviously, it's huge and there's different departments, but that's the only person that's coming to mind. But maybe there were other folks I've talked to that have worked there or work there now. So, from what I hear, it's a pretty awesome place. That's what I hear.
It's pretty great. I mean, it's interesting because it's actually, I think. I'm not sure how many off the top of my head at the moment, but there's somewhere between 60 or 70 different institutes that are dotted all over Germany and a few outside of Germany too. And they each focus on a different topic. And I'm in the one that's focused on human development. And it's great. I mean, it's really a really great system. My job is they brought me in, they generously gave me a big pot of money and basically said, go research whatever you want for, 5 to 8 years. And that's the dream. What I'm doing. And it's incredible. It's been a wonderful experience. I highly recommend it.
Yeah, no, it sounds wonderful. Well, I guess the two kind of follow-up questions here. So why infants? So why is that your kind of focus in the developmental thread here? Why not adults or adolescents or geriatrics or whatever? Why infants? And then I guess why the evolutionary history and regarding the interaction with plant and plant life and all that? How did you get to these two kind of two areas to spend your time researching and focusing on this?
Yeah, I mean, it ends up being kind of a long story, but I started my undergraduate career at Boston University, and I was working in a behavior genetics lab under the direction of Kim Sedino because I was really interested in thinking from just, I don't know why this is my interest, but I was just really interested in thinking about what are the kind of biological influences on human behavior. Like, how can you understand humans scientifically? I think some part of me always knew I wanted to be a researcher, and it was just finding kind of what I wanted to research. I just like knowing what's true, that's probably the wrong way to say it. I'm interested in finding out what's going on, basically. And so I started there, and then while I was there, I got in contact with Deb Kellerman's lab, she does cognitive development research. And I just started reading those papers, and I just thought it was fascinating. It just kind of fit my interests. And I always was really drawn to infant cognition because you really have to be very creative and very precise to study infants and to study infants well. Because when you're working with infants, you can't give them the backstory before you give them the experiment. So with an adult, you can say, okay, I'm going to show you a story and it's about X, Y, and Z, and you can kind of frame it up for them before they go in. But with an infant, the study stimuli just have to evoke what it is that you're trying to communicate to them or that you're trying to test. And not only do you have to do that, but then you have to do it in a very precise and very controlled way so that you are in fact isolating specific aspects of behavior or specific features of the world. And I just always found that absolutely fascinating, how you could do that. And along with just a general kind of theoretical interest in how do we as humans come equipped in the world to be able to kind of build a human brain over the course of development. And just all of those things were fascinating. So I started out in that area with that set of interests. And then I was looking for graduate programs, and I applied a number of different places. And I was actually fortunate, this was many years ago now, I was fortunate enough to get accepted with several fantastic people. But I ended up visiting UC Santa Barbara. And while I was there, I got to hear more about this evolutionary psychology thing. And I really had not been exposed much to it at the point that I was doing my applications. I just didn't know anything about it. But when I got there and I talked to the students and I talked to some of the other faculty, it was just really clear that this was an approach that could answer kind of a burning question I had at the time, which is, at the time in the early kind of 2000s, where I was doing this, the field of infant cognition was putting forward, there are several different domains of infant cognition, or several different areas that you can study. So how infants learn about objects, how infants learn about number, or how infants understand social agents. And as a naive undergraduate student, I just been thinking, well, how do you know what the things are, what those areas are, or what they should be? Like, why objects? Why number? Why social agent? I ended up having a conversation with Lita Cosmides, where she asked me, "What are you thinking about?" And I said some, I'm sure, garbled version of that. And she said, well, this approach can give you a way of thinking about that. And it's a way of thinking about what are the kinds of problems that humans have faced over evolutionary time. How do selection dynamics work such that you can think about how evolutionary processes within those constraints might build certain kinds of human cognitive design, human cognitive architecture, and how you can make predictions about that, and then how you can study that empirically. And so it was just kind of a perfect fit for my interest. My immediate advisor, Tamsin German, was studying theory of mind, which was a topic I was really, really especially interested at that time. And then this broader community of people doing evolutionary psychology was just a really exciting and new thing. So that's kind of how I got into both the cognitive development world and the evolutionary world. But it wasn't until my postdoc that then I actually got to work with infants. So I mostly worked with preschoolers and adults while I was in graduate school. And then I was lucky enough to have a postdoc position with Karen Wynn at Yale in the Infant Cognition Center, and really got to work with babies. And then that's what I've carried forward methodologically.
So I definitely want to come to all the plants, because that's the more recent stuff. So kind of following that, though, again, just kind of, if you can give us, I haven't talked about infants too much on here, so it'd be very interesting here. So just kind of give us the just broad overview of what we know about human infant cognitive abilities, right? You mentioned, so my background's clinical psych, so we do a bunch of human development stuff, and we do all the psych assessment stuff. So we learn about, sensory motor functioning, and 0 to 2 is all the sensory motor function stuff. And, obviously, Piaget is there, Vygotsky and Luria to a certain extent, all the information processing models and, all these types of things. And so, but, Piaget is obviously the big person on the scene. I mean, he's not the only one. Not everything he said was right, but, he's kind of big. He's in his major stages of cognitive development. Obviously, there's the theory of mind stuff, which is very fascinating. My understanding is that stuff is pretty developed by 5. Is this correct? Theory of mind is more or less 5, or is that been corrected for now? Is it earlier or later? How do we think about that?
That's a good question. I mean, so there's sort of several different things. So, I mean, to just step back and kind of give the overview of infant cognition part.
Yeah, you were talking about these domains of how we understand infant cognition. Yeah.
So basically, I mean, I guess the best place to start would be sort of the broad theoretical space into which infant cognition research was born. So basically, some of the first studies with infants were done looking at the first kind of scientific studies looking at infant vision and infant cognition really started to get off the ground in kind of the very late 70s and early 80s. And that was coming out of the behaviorist period, where basically the idea was, the kind of overarching idea is that infants are born as blank slates. Humans are born as blank slates. They come equipped with a few kind of simple associationist, domain general, like kind of all-purpose cognitive mechanisms. And then by just making associations and having those either rewarded or punished, you build a human brain. And then what started to happen is people started doing this work, and a lot of it was originally actually based in Piaget, or kind of inspired by his ideas and testing his ideas. So, for example, the work on objects was looking at whether infants do indeed have object permanence. So the understanding that objects continue to exist even when you can't see them. Right. And so some of the studies, this is René Baillargeon's work, is I think one of the people who's most well known for this. In order to test things with infants, like I say, you have to be really creative. And so she did some studies where she basically had tracks with what looked like little train cars going down a ramp. And then she would show the infants a block being placed on this train track. And then a screen would go up and somehow the car would still zoom right through as if the block wasn't there. And now, if the baby has no object permanence, then that should be fine. That event should be kind of an expected event for them. Whereas if they're expecting objects should still continue to exist, then they should be surprised if that train kind of zooms through the solid objects that's there. And what people figured out is that you can tell whether or not babies are surprised by measuring how long they look at things. So babies, in terms
of sustained gaze. So how long are they or sustained attention, and both gaze and attention of the object or objects that are moving?
So you actually measure where they look and for how long. And it's that simple. So basically, because you can't ask them questions, you have to look at what they're doing. And even very little babies have pretty good control over their eyes. So they can't, a 3-month-old can't reach out and pick up something reliably yet, but you can see where their eyes are pointed. So you can set up these events. And then, the way that there's 2 ways you can do it, and both are still in use, but it started out with just a live coder, meaning a person sitting off to either behind the stage or to the side of the stage and watching where the baby's eyes are and saying, yes, the baby's eyes are pointed at the relevant part of the display, or no, they're not. So the baby is looking and they're not. So you get how long they look at those kinds of events, or that particular kind of event with the block on the track, for example. And then you compare that to events where the block is off the track. So you try and keep everything as similar as possible. You've still got the train. You've even still got the block. It's just sitting behind the track instead of on the track. So this is what I mean about with infant studies. You have to be both very clever and very precise. So you keep everything the same except the one thing that you are trying to isolate. And then you see, when you change that one thing, do the patterns of babies, does the baby's attentional pattern change? right? So are they looking longer at what would be predicted to be an unexpected event? Or are they looking longer at what would be predicted to be an expected event? And just with that kind of measure, you can find out an awful lot. So you can do that with a live coder. Now people use eye trackers. There's kind of pluses and minuses to doing both things. And as I said, both are still in use. So you can use their visual attention to really get a handle on what's going on. But basically, starting testing object permanence is directly looking at Piaget. And what people found out is that, this is it's been a while since I've talked about this stuff. So this is all kind of coming out at once.
Right.
But basically, Piaget's theory is based on studies that he actually did. He did studies. And if you use Piaget's methods, you get his results. And it's actually a fun thing you can do in developmental psychology classes is you can have people go out and do these kinds of studies. And they show the pattern of development that Piaget wrote about. But what turns out to be true is that there's a lot that goes on in any kind of task that is kind of in addition to the thing that you are looking at. And this is called task demands, right? So you have to remember certain things. You have to be able to give a precise verbal response, maybe, or you have to have good fine motor skills. And so what people found with the infant cognition measure, with the infant measures, where you're basically just looking at where babies are pointing their eyes, you can strip out a lot of those task demands. You can make the task easier. And so if you lower the demands of the task, you actually find evidence that infants can do these things far, far younger than Piaget thought.
So yeah, that's interesting. So I follow the logic here. It seems that then, if I remember correctly, object permanence is it's the fourth substage of the sensory motor. It's in 8 to 12 months is usually where it starts. I mean, it goes up until 18 months and all that stuff, but it's usually around 8-ish months or so. So you're saying that there's elements where it might be sooner, or it's not necessarily confined to a specific period. It could be, if you're doing all the task demand kinds of things and you're able to focus on the one thing, that it could be that it's already there, at least in a latent sense.
Yeah, and that's what the studies show. So they show it's been a little while since I looked at the object representation literature, but I mean, as young as you can reliably test these things, I think starting around even 3 months of age, infants do show visual patterns that suggest that they do expect objects to continue to exist.
So with that, so back to the theory of mind thing. So theory of mind could be, somewhere, I mean, the way I've understood is that 2 to 3 is where it starts, 4-ish is where it starts to become a little bit more solidified. And by 5 is where we have, theory of mind, that people are able to have some type of perspective taking of other things or other, et cetera. And so it's the same thing with the kind of task demand things, right? Okay. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And that was so my graduate advisor, Tamsin German, came from a research tradition that was specifically looking at what are the task demands in a theory of mind task. And this is work that was, there's a lot of this work was headed by Alan Leslie at Rutgers. And it is basically, the argument is that if you reduce the task demands for tasks assessing theory of mind, you find that children pass them even earlier. So kind of the which you may already be familiar with this, but the standard task to look at theory of mind is the false belief task. And so that's the task where Sally comes in and she puts her marble in a basket. And then while Sally is out of the room, mean old Anne comes in and moves the marble from the basket to the box. And then Sally comes back in. Where's she going to look for her marble? And the typical pattern is that 3-year-olds fail the task but 4-year-olds pass it. So around 4, they start correctly predicting that Sally is going to look in the basket where she thinks the marble is, as opposed to the box where the marble actually is at the point that she's searching. And so that was kind of the lay of the land for a long time. And then Alan Leslie and my advisor and a number of other people were doing work saying, well, if you move the task demands, around, there's some evidence that theory of mind is present before this 3 years of age. And then the infant researchers figured out how you can do a looking time version of the false belief task. And there was a famous paper published in 2005, Onishi and Bayerjan, showing that at 15 months, infants seem to be able to pass the false belief task. And then when I was, at the time I was in graduate school, there was a lot of work being done, looking at elements of theory of mind or false belief reasoning. And there was some suggestion that some of these abilities were present even earlier, before the first birthday. Currently, there's some debate about how well those tasks replicate. So it's all a little bit, at least to my knowledge at the moment, it's all a little bit unclear. And you can find people who will say, of course, there must be elements of theory of mind present in infancy, and but then other people will say, no, there's really no evidence for that because these tasks don't replicate. It must be something else. And I think everybody's willing to say there's building blocks of a theory of mind there, but whether or not infants can really understand other people's mental states, their beliefs that conflict with the actual state of the world, is still very much an open question. But I think there's fewer people, and maybe this is just my own kind of background training that says this, but I think there's fewer people who would say that it is definitely not until 4. But
let me just for listeners, let me just kind of say, you can help me out here with this, but why this is so important, and why researchers or people that are doing anything with psychology or cognition or things like that are really interested in this. Theory of mind is the idea that you're able to take the perspective of others, that you understand that another person has also thoughts and feelings and intuitions, and that you're able to, in some ways, understand the kind of that the things that you have, another person has, at least, that they do have thoughts and feelings, that people can be misleading, they can have false beliefs, or they can lie, or things like that. And obviously this is helpful for certain types of empathy as well, that you can care if somebody else gets hurt or not. Where we see this has some dysfunction for neurodevelopmental issues is with autism. Is usually, again, not all folks that have autism have poor theory of mind, but many do. And this is difficult when understanding social cues and understanding facial recognition and understanding. So it's a very social thing, and it's a very human thing. Although we do see theory of mind of sorts, some rudimentary elements of it in other species. I can't remember which ones, but it's assumed, or it's hypothesized, or there's some evidence that maybe other primates have some aspect of it, or whatever. So this is it feels not exclusively human, but predominantly human, and it's something that's really important to understand. Some of the uniqueness, if you will, I'd like to not use that word, but some of the things that are distinctive, I should say, about humans. And then how early this is can tell you a few things. I mean, the first thing is that it tells you that if it's earlier than usual, that there's a lot more that infants understand about their environment than we suspect, right? And that's really helpful for trying to understand practical things of socialization, attachment, the types of, homes they live in, the communities they reside in, on and on and on and on. So this has a lot of very practical implications to know what is it that they know about them, some type of self-recognition, and then what is it that they can understand about other people as well. And that's a tremendous thing to know, that, okay, if someone has it at 4 or 5, okay, there's someone's, verbal, ostensibly, they have language, they're kind of getting into school age. Okay, you could kind of expect that of sorts. But if there are at the very least building blocks for some type of theory of mind, which is what we just usually ascribe as high cognition, meaning that it's something in prefrontal cortex, although it's, I don't think, exclusively there. There's things about that say, whoa, if this is at 15 months or 12 months or 18 months, that's much different. That paints a different picture of the potential quasi-metacognition, or the things that human infants can have at an early age. So that, am I getting this right about the kind of like utility and the like why this is a big deal? Why do people and researchers think about this stuff, and why it's important?
Yeah, and yeah, that's right. And it's also a topic that has roots in a couple different traditions, including there's a whole vast philosophy and philosophy of mind literature on this as well, where, it's a way, it tells you, and this is another way of saying what you already said, but it kind of gives you a window of what kind of mind you're working with. Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. And so whether that's cross species or humans at different ages. And I think that the broad picture that's emerged is from stepping back, not just with theory of mind, but with infant cognition generally. I think that the broad picture that's emerged over the last, 40 plus years of people really seriously doing this work is that it's certainly the case that the blank slate view is wrong. Mm-hmm. Infants come equipped with different expectations for different kinds of things out in the world. They have different expectations about how objects will behave than how agents or other things that can kind of move around, people and non-human animals, how those will behave. They have different expectations. And my work shows, the work I'm doing now shows they have different expectations about plants than other kinds of things. So humans are coming, as a species, we come equipped not with just one simple, powerful associative rule, but we come equipped with a lot of structure that helps us to sort the information that's coming in from the environment, to organize it, and then to interact with the relevant features of the environment in ways that over developmental time build these specific kinds of knowledge banks that allow us to operate in the world. And it's not things that we're conscious of. I mean, for example, with theory of mind, it's not like you have to say, oh, well, in order to have a conversation, or in order to just not bump into somebody on the street, I should have an understanding that person's beliefs can be different from mine, and da 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 da. You just have to know, oh, that person doesn't see me.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
But it's kind of where you get into, as a psychologist, as a cognitive scientist, looking at what are the underlying cognitive rules or cognitive architecture that's responsible for doing this. What does that look like? What are the expectations? What are the representations that are built? Is it really is it an actual belief, meaning that it's got this representational nature, or is it some other kind of representation that doesn't quite fit the belief category, but instead it's some other kind of thing? And this is where the philosophers go into this in great detail about what kind of representation is actually being formed. There's a lot of ways you can have arguments about theory of mind that kind of push cognitive science forward. And I think it's really done that. So it's really important to kind of the philosophy of mind, to psychology, developmental psychology, cognitive development, and then also these really important practical implications for understanding autism and just humans generally.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, one of the most underrated philosophers, definitely in the 20th century, someone that I really enjoy his work, is Merleau-Ponty, who had many things to say, obviously about phenomenology, obviously about the mind and the body, and he also did some really, really interesting work in understanding child psychology and understanding that in a way he used a lot of stuff through the body. how do humans understand things through the body? The body is an essential feature of our phenomenological experience, which is kind of transcendent of sorts. Not to say it's above per se, but that it's not objective and it's not subjective. It's all of the experience, and which has those pieces included, right? And many phenomenologists believe this way. But he also believed, when it came to children and infants as well, that he believed that they had their way of navigating through the world. They had a phenomenological experience, right? He also didn't have the whole blank slate kind of thing either, and what that's about. And he thought that you could find that out if they're nonverbal, through types of play or types of different ways of facial expressions, but also through the body, and that it was individualized. And how do they experience their world around them? There's a series of lectures he did on child psychology, I think within the psychology department at one of the universities in Paris or France, and really, really interesting stuff, because he's doing philosophy, but he's he's talking to, at the time, psychology students and things like that. And so really interesting work. I mean, I think this was in the 40s or 50s, that I think has a lot of merit. I think it has a lot of really, really important perspectives that we should, consider. And it sounds again, that people have also been thinking about theory of mind, and there's this way of evolutionary theories working in one way, cognitive science is working in one way, philosophy can work in one way. So it's interesting how these all kind of start to collide of sorts in good ways, I think, in good ways. I guess the question I have here is about, so just kind of run us through a little bit of some of the categories. We don't have to spend time on all of them, but in terms of infant cognition, and then we can move to your research on plants. We've talked about theory of mind, a little bit of perspective taking. We talked about different things. So what are some of these other kind of categories when we think about infant cognition? So obviously there's not abstraction like how you and I do abstraction as adults, right? There's not in the same way, at least, right? They obviously don't have language in the same way that we do, et cetera. So what is it at an infant period that they have for these kind of domains or categories for their cognition?
Yeah, and I mean, so one general thing I will say is that my years of being an infant researcher have taught me, I think, a general way to frame up thinking about infant cognition is human infants don't have an adult brain. That's clear. There's a lot of development between infancy and adulthood, but human infants have a human brain, and there's a lot there's a lot of complexity there in having a human brain that I think had anyway before people really started doing this work had gone unrecognized. So it's actually they do different kinds of abstraction. So for example, one of the other areas that people have looked at is infants' understanding of number. And that means even very small infants, 3 to 5 month olds, being able to do simple math. So knowing that if you have, and this was my advisor, Karen Wynn, my postdoc advisor, Karen Wynn, did a lot of this work where you have 2 Mickey Mouse dolls, let's say, on a stage. And then you put a barrier up so that the baby can't see the Mickey Mouse dolls anymore. And you show a hand coming in and a hand takes away one of the Mickey Mouse dolls. If you lower the barrier, the babies are surprised if there's still 2 dolls there. So even though that's what they saw before, they're expecting that 2 things, take 1 away, there should be 1 left. And so even at very, very, even at 3 months of age, infants are able to do this kind of simple arithmetic, which is a very abstract thing. It's a very abstract construct. And it seems like, they can do these sorts of simple addition and subtraction between 1 to 4 objects. And then once you get up past about 4 objects, it seems to be more about general amount, like amount of stuff, but they have expectations about amounts of things. So it's fascinating when you dig into the details of this, of what infants really are capable of doing. And if you start unpacking what the representational structure must be in order to do that. The infants have to have representations that there are two objects there. They have to remember they have to be able to maintain that representation when those things are out of sight. And then they have to know that one being pulled away means that there should just be one left. I mean, and this is very little babies who are in fact able to do this. So of course they're not doing calculus, like an adult would, but
I can't do calculus either. So.
yeah, me neither. But they are able to do these things that would have been seen as impossible under kind of a blank slate associationist view. Like it would just be impossible. And under a view where there's no way that infants understand abstract concepts or can do abstraction in any way. There's no way they should be able to do this. And you can always find people who will argue that there's some other way that they're doing it. But I mean, people have been working on this for a while now. And I think it's pretty well established that infants can do this. So you have expectations about objects, and the behavior of objects is one area that people have researched, where infants seem to have coherent sets of principles about the way that objects should behave. Infants have coherent sets of principles about numbers, so the simple addition, subtraction, amount of stuff. Infants have sets of expectations about agents, how agents, meaning like living things, or anything that kind of has self-propelled movements, things that aren't an object. So you can study agency. You can look at agency with things that are not actually alive, but exhibit cues of enough cues of aliveness. Another domain that people are looking at is sociality. So how they expect other people to interact and how they expect other people to treat each other, and even expectations of kind of fairness, even at very young ages. And then there's a ton of work, of course, on language and what is required in order to actually learn a language, which is just absolutely, and that's an area that's like quite well worked out. And then, I mean, I think the work that I've been doing since my graduate career ended. So when I went to the infant lab at Yale, I had been thinking in the back of my mind about this whole problem with plants. But, I didn't really have an opportunity to do it because I was doing my dissertation work on theory of mind. And when I got to Yale, I was lucky enough that I kind of had an open-ended possibility. And I was talking to Karen Wynn about, here's some ideas I have about theory of mind. What would you like to study? And I said, but I also have this idea that babies might know stuff about plants. And Karen, to paraphrase, was basically, go do that. And so she was supportive and let me really develop this other project. And so my work shows that now infants have expectations about plants, right? So and that was something that people didn't really know about because people hadn't really looked into it. And my sort of scientific bet about this is there's actually a lot of areas that infants have expectations about that we just haven't bothered to look into yet, or we just haven't gotten around to looking into yet. Because, I mean, psychology is a young field. Infant cognition, infancy research is young within psychology. It takes a long time to do studies. Certainly. There's a lot that's unexplored. And so I think there are a lot of areas where you would expect organized principles for how to understand the world that we just haven't gotten to yet.
Yeah. Well, tell us about your work. Tell us about what you've been doing the past couple of years. Tell us about your research. If you want, I can give you a lot of runway and you can go with this, or I can interrupt you a bunch of times and ask you a bunch of follow-ups. You can do it any way you want, but maybe just kind of give us maybe the broad, you've already kind of given us a little bit of the overview, but just kind of more specifically, what is the dynamic relationship between plants and or the environment with infants, et cetera, and then just kind of fill in, or fill out data that you've been discovering or gathering or collecting, and then how that contributes to our evolving ideas about infants.
Yeah. And feel free to interrupt along the way. So as I mentioned before, my work looks at how infants learn about plants, and I picked this topic for a few reasons, but there are kind of two ways that I really started to get interested in the topic. And this is while I was a graduate student at Santa Barbara. In the developmental and evolutionary psychology program there, you have a lot of contact with people outside of psychology. So HBES, the Human Behavior and Evolution Society conference, is where a lot of people who study evolutionary psychology present their work. But it's a very interdisciplinary approach. So you have a lot of contact with anthropologists, with behavioral ecologists, with primatologists, and all these people who study humans and non-humans in very different ways than we tend to in psychology. Right.
As a footnote to that, more and more that is becoming or trying to become more normative, right? Where there's a multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary kind of convergence. So that way it's not people in these camps, like here's all the anthropologists and here's all the sociologists and here's all the ecologists. It's more of how are we all getting together and sharing what we're seeing about, similar things from different angles to have a more robust and complete and comprehensive understanding about people and people in the world and other organisms, etc. So that's a nice way where many fields are moving.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it was a fantastic environment in which to be a graduate student, where you're kind of really soaking up all kinds of ideas. And so I would see presentations by anthropologists who were going to the field and who were working with indigenous societies and looking at things like calorie return over the lifespan, right? So like when you go out hunting, how many calories do you bring back over, when you're 10 versus when you're 50, and what do those curves look like, and what can they tell you about like the evolution of the human lifespan? And a lot of the talks were focused on hunting returns, which are extremely interesting. But then they would talk about how but there's this base of calories that comes from plant foraging, that serves as this kind of constant base. And I remember thinking, how do you do that? What is the knowledge that goes into that kind of food acquisition? Like that actually, if you really start thinking about that, that turns out to be a really difficult problem. And that was particularly brought home to me because while I was a graduate student, I also did a lot of trail running. So I would run up in the mountains in California and, far out into the wilderness with people. And I would think, if I got stuck out here, if something happened and I got stuck out here, I would die. But people lived here for tens of thousands of years off this exact land. Like there is a way to do this. I don't know what I would die. This is a really, really hard problem. And I bet there's a lot of really interesting cognitive architecture that goes along with this. And so I started really, as a graduate student, thinking through this problem of, okay, foraging for plants. What are the benefits that plants provide for people? What are the costs? What do you have to pay attention to? How are plants, how do plants work was part of what I was looking into. And basically over the course of a couple of years, what I came to put together, and drawing on a lot of great work that people did in anthropology and in looking at non-human animal behavior, is that the basic logic is, as a human, you have to, as a forager, decide which plants in your environment are the ones that you can eat or you can use for some kind of purpose, and which are the ones that could hurt you. And those three kinds of things, what can you eat, what can you use, and what can hurt you, are often overlapping in interesting kinds of ways. Because plants seem like very benign sorts of things. They're like these pretty things we have in pots, or like they're these nice things in the background, or it's stuff at the botanical garden. But plants have this problem where they need to make sure that their predators are not destroying them. Right. And they have to do this in a specific way because plants are literally rooted in the ground. So they can't run away from the stuff that eats them. So they have to find other ways of generating defenses. And largely what they do is they generate toxic chemicals. And so plants are basically these chemical weapons factories, where the chemicals are really tuned largely. I mean, most of the things that eat plants are insects, but of course, lots of other animals do as well. But it's certainly not just humans eating plants. And so what that means as a human, when you look at the botanical world, there aren't these really clear signals that like, oh, well, a plant with a red fruit, that's something I can eat. Or a plant with a pointy leaf, that's something that's dangerous, because plants are adapted to all of these other critters that aren't us. At the same time, plants do have other strategies. So, for example, if there's a plant that is toxic, a non-toxic to a particular kind of predator that is in the area, if there's a plant nearby that is non-toxic, it can evolve to look like the toxic plant as a way of protecting it. So plants also in general can look quite similar to each other, but there's also these strategies that they have that there are a lot of ways that make it very difficult to tell plants apart. And particularly as a baby, as an infant, there's like green stuff in the world. But in order to really tell apart deadly plants from dangerous ones, you need to really pay attention to these fine details. And importantly, it's not the kind of thing you can do on your own.
Sorry. So I have a question about the plants together, in terms of toxic and non-toxic. Is there a coevolution with different plants? So over time, they've evolved to say, hey, if I look like this, then this will protect me. If I look like the ones that are toxic or whatever, has there been a protective thing or an evolutionary component to it where it's trying to survive or succeed through time, that there's this coevolution with plants? And then more generally, is there or I should say more in an extended way, there has been also a coevolution of plants with humans as well, correct? So what's the coevolution with plants with each other and plants with humans? What's that coevolution story there?
Yeah, and that is, so the details of that are something that I am definitely not expert in, and there are other people who can give you a much better answer than I can. But what I can tell you is that there must be cases where, there's a whole broad class of plants that are really closely adapted with humans, and that's all the domesticated plants.
But what's an example of one?
Corn.
Okay.
Like any of the plants basically that we are used to interacting with, the things that you buy at the store, all of that stuff has been explicitly selected by humans or all of that stuff has been like, it's been artificially selected, right? So there's natural selection and there's artificial selection, and humans have artificially selected most of the plants that we're used to seeing to have like these really crazy features that they probably don't have if they're in wild environments. So like tomatoes having these huge red, big giant tomato fruits, as opposed to out in the wild, an original tomato plant's probably very tiny, or like wheat used to be grass. So you have these, wheat is a grass, but the kernels of the wheat were like these very small things. And then we as humans over time selected plants to have these features that are the things that we want them to have. To the point where you have whole strains of crops where they can't reproduce without humans doing it. Right. So this is a very artificial thing. So all of those things are obviously very, 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 very tightly adapted to humans, and all of that through kind of artificial selection processes. But in if you kind of cast your mind back to hunter-gatherer worlds, I imagine it must be the case that some plants were certainly in tight coevolutionary relationships with humans. Like that almost certainly has to be the case. But if you're walking through a forest or you're walking through the savanna, the majority of plants that you encounter are not going to have tight relationships with humans necessarily. Mm-hmm. They're going to have a tight relationship with a particular kind of bird species, or they're going to have a tight relationship with a particular kind of insect, like figs and fig wasps, where, you have fig trees basically can reproduce because of these teeny little fig wasps that go in and pollinate inside these inside out flowers that are the figs. And these whole huge trees don't exist without these teeny tiny little insects. So because plants are in relationships with a lot of different species, and even figs, I mean, they're not just in a relationship with the fig wasp, they're then in relationships with all of the other creatures that eat figs, which we eat figs, but so do all kinds of other human primates and, all kinds of other birds. So it means that from a human perspective, you kind of can't trust the botanical world to signal to you. You have to learn the details of the individual species that have the parts that you can eat, that have the parts that you can use to make the things you need to make. So, I mean, humans, we have this really rich material culture. We need to find raw materials to make a lot of those things. If you're thinking back over evolutionary time, that's coming from the natural environment, a huge chunk of which is plants. And the relationship with edibility is complicated because plants are for the most part, plants don't want to be eaten, because it's bad for them if they get eaten, except for things like seed dispersal, where they want to have certain parts of themselves eaten at like certain points in the season by particular animals who will disperse the seeds. So you can have a plant where the part of the plant is edible, but another part of it is toxic, or the part that's edible is only edible at a certain time of the year. And then you have to know that. Or in the case of humans, we do this really interesting thing of we prepare our food, we cook it. We use all of these different complex processing techniques in a way that, other animals process their food, but not to any degree like humans do. And so there are all of these staples of human diets, which are either inedible or just toxic before you do all these processing steps. So for example, because I was thinking about this when I was a graduate student in California, the Shumash, who lived in Southern California, one of the staples of their diet were acorns. And you can't just pick an acorn off the tree and eat it. You have to get the acorns at a certain time. Then I'm going to forget all of the steps, but basically you have to dry them for a set amount of time. You have to grind them. You have to leach the tannins out of them by having them soak in water and drying them out again. And then in the end, you end up with a mash. Like after several weeks, you end up with a mash that you cook, and then you can eat that. And that is the staple of like a human diet. And so all of that means that finding the right plants to pick takes a lot of knowledge and a lot of know-how. Once you have those plants, what to do with them is a lot of knowledge and a lot of know-how. And all of that is around these very fundamental things of the food that we're eating, the clothes that we're wearing, the tools that we're using in order to make our human lives possible. And it's all plants. Well, it's not all plants, but there's a large chunk of it that's plants. And that is a very complicated thing to actually figure out how to do all of that. So, and it's really something that intersects really closely with, it is human culture, right? In order to do this, you have to, as a species, build up this cultural knowledge about what are the plants in our local environment, how do we use them, how do we process them. It is not the kind of thing you can do alone. Instead, the structure of these kinds of mechanisms, a fundamental component of these mechanisms should be this learning component and this social learning component, such that you're using the expertise of the other people around you to figure out this very, very difficult problem. And so I got interested, this is obviously to really go into this is a much larger problem than I have been able to tackle. But my particular interest in this was to look at, well, what are the roots of this kind of system in infants? So you have this category of thing in the world, plants, that are of fundamental importance to human beings. They're by, the logic, the theoretical logic is there is likely to be this social learning component. And, at the time I put this forward, this was just logic, but now I've actually worked with an evolutionary biologist and with one of my postdocs to model this, to actually do the modeling. And it falls out of evolutionary modeling that there should be a social learning component to plants. And so, right, how is this done? And so I started with some very basic questions about, okay, well, how do infants avoid plant dangers? And then are they particularly attentive to certain kinds of social information? And so this is an area that in infants, to my knowledge, hadn't been looked at. I think, as we talked about before, there's a lot of things that people haven't gotten to yet. And so I started doing a series of studies thinking about, well, how can infants avoid plant dangers? And then what kind of information should they be attentive for? How can we test for that? And over the last now over a decade, I've built a series of findings that I hope kind of form the basis of looking at the cognitive architecture for learning about plants in infancy and kind of building out on what that looks like in infants, with an idea that there's a lot of work to be done in infancy, but you can look at that in young children. You could look at that in adults. You could look at that, across the lifespan. I think infants are really useful in this regard because certainly when it comes to interacting with plants, many of us who live in, quote unquote weird societies are the Western educated, industrialized, rich and democratic societies. We really don't have anything to do with plants. We're very far removed from how people over evolutionary time would interact with plants. And it's certainly true that that's true of our babies too, but they haven't existed in it quite as long. So they're maybe not quite as weird as adults are. So I think that's one of the utilities of looking at infants for these kinds of questions.
Yeah, I was going to ask just about that. It sounds like this has probably contributed to our evolutionary history over time. But nowadays, a lot of people aren't living out in the wild, or, we have cities and we have towns and we have ways of cultivating, that are much different than they were, 10,000 years, 1,000 years ago, 500 years ago, 100 years ago. I mean, so it's so the current age we're living in is interesting. But obviously when you have tens of thousands of years where we lived one way, that's going to be kind of encoded in us as humans of sorts. But that question aside for a minute, I want to ask, what more specifically have you found with infants and plants? So in one of your papers, you talk about the plant, in all caps, experiment in terms of categorizing and discriminations. So maybe tell us about that. And then you also have a plant experience questionnaire, which is super interesting. So we can talk about the nerdy psychometrics of that. That can be fun too. So just tell us about these things, some of your experiments, and then having, some a type of measure created, some more of the specific things on the work you've done with this concept.
Yeah. So where this started was with the two kind of broad questions of how do infants avoid plant dangers, and then what kinds of things might they be particularly attuned to learning. And with plant dangers, what we started to look at is, so as I mentioned before, with plants, they can be deadly poisonous, but they are rooted to the spot. So just as the plants can't run away from the stuff that eats plants, it also means that a dangerous plant is not going to run after you as a human baby in the middle of the night. It's not like a snake or a spider or a dangerous animal that could show up to you. In order to get injured by a plant, you have to physically approach it. Right.
So because plants are I don't know if I want to use that word. I don't want to say static. They're in one place.
Stationary. They're stationary.
It's stationary. Yeah. There's the agent or the actor or the participant or whomever in the world, the infant in this scenario, is the one that's doing the work in some ways initially. They have to make contacts. They have to be curious about it. They have to be interested. They have to, maybe it's the colors, maybe it's the scent, maybe it's how it looks or whatever. Before that happens, there's no, the plant is passive in some ways.
That's right. Exactly. So if there's a deadly dangerous plant in your yard, you could have it there for forever and never get hurt by it unless you go up to it and stick a chunk of it in your mouth, right? Mm-hmm. So what this means is that there is a very, very, very straightforward way to minimize plant dangers, which is if you don't know what a plant is, just don't touch it.
Well, but that's what I do.
Yeah,
because I'm always paranoid. I was like, I don't want poison oak or poison ivy. It looks too similar. I'm not going to go and touch that. No way. That's a terrible thing to have. Like, I don't want anything near that.
Exactly. And so that's where we started with this very simple thing. And there's two things to say right off the bat. So the first is that this is not the only protective mechanism that people or even infants have with respect to plants. There are other things that we can talk about that that people have discovered in other areas or looking at other things. And it's also not the case that the way we have studied this is the way that I would think this would unfold in natural environments, right? So because we work in a laboratory setting largely, we do studies to look at this. So that the big overarching prediction is that we should see some evidence that infants avoid touching plants relative to other kinds of things. Right. This is the big overarching thing. When I first started doing this or first started talking about this, a lot of people told me, well, there's no way there's going to be anything about, there's no way that's going to be true because everybody knows babies stick everything in their mouths. Right. So this is the kind of thing that people say, well, babies stick everything in their mouths. This is okay. Maybe see if you're going to get anything there.
They stick a lot of things in their mouth. They don't stick everything in their mouth, though. Exactly.
And there's a study, there's a famous study that Paul Rosen did in the 80s, I think, where that people in the cognitive development world tend to cite as babies stick everything in their mouths because the study shows that babies young children, toddlers will stick things in their mouths that adults never would. So like things like fake dog poop, and a baby will stick in their mouth, but an adult certainly wouldn't. And there's a whole literature looking at disgust, basically, and that like relative to adults, disgust sensitivity is much lower in young kids. Which anybody who has a small child knows that little kids will do things that big people think is really gross.
This is gross.
So that's all true. But at the same time, there really is this problem where these plant toxins, some of them are mild, but to humans, but some of them are really, really serious. Like there are some of these toxins where just one bite of these things can stop your heart and can cause you, can cause cascades of different issues. And as I said before, it's not like the plants that have these really deadly toxins have big signs on them that say, no, don't eat this, or there's not like a particular color or something. So when I was developing the logic of this, what that predicted to me was that, first of all, there's this simple don't mess with it, like avoid touching it if you don't, and do that particularly if you don't know what it is. So like if you don't have information about it, the sort of safest route is to basically have the baby's brain set up to just not engage with it.
Mm.
And so we've done now, I started one study doing this. We have now done many studies looking at this using many different variations of the kinds of stimulus items I'm about to describe. I can talk about them in detail, but and we find the same pattern over and over again. So basically what we did is, so as I mentioned before, we did this in a laboratory setting so we can have everything nice and controlled. And the way that you do infant work is often, so we did this with infants from about 8 months of age to about 18 months of age. We did this broad age range because it was the first time looking at this. And initially I thought that maybe, there's a lot of motor development from 8 to 18 months. There's a lot of other kinds of development going on. I wondered if this would be similar across the age range or different. So we started this big broad age range. And what we did is we had the babies sitting on their parents' laps across the table from an experimenter. And the experimenter would take our different stimulus objects, these different objects, one at a time, and put them down in front of the baby. And then we would just measure how long it took for the baby to reach out and touch the object. There's two important parts about this. One is that the parent's eyes are closed so that the parent doesn't know what object is in front of the baby. So the baby is not reading the kind of reaction of the parents. And we really strongly train our experimenters so that they do everything the same every time. And then we go back through our videos and we do coding of our experimenters by people who are blind to what's going on to see if we can pick up on any differences. And our experimenters are well trained to present these things all very evenly. So what we do is we present a series of objects that include real plants. So these are things that for, ethical reasons in case something goes wrong, they're things like basil and parsley. They're kind of these kitchen herb plants. Then we present.
So no poison ivy.
No poison ivy. I don't think that the ethics review boards, the IRB boards,
the IRB is not going to allow for that one. No.
Yeah, exactly. So we have the real plants, then we have artificial plants, and we get artificial plants that you can buy at a craft store, or you can make the parts from them, and we get ones that look really good, and we do that for two reasons. So one is that the real plants, the things you learn while testing babies or while doing science generally, the real plants grow and change and die over the course of testing, right?
Yes,
so you're constantly switching out which plant it is. And then you have ones where like the basil's flopped over and the parsley's doing this and whatever else. And so we wanted to have plant exemplars that weren't going to change so much over the course of testing. And then we also wanted plants exemplars, I say because they're not like, they're artificial plants that don't have any scent to them, because the basil and parsley smell really nice. And so you could imagine that maybe babies aren't reacting to plants per se, but they're reacting to the stuff that smells. So that's why we wanted a plant that didn't have a clear scent. So we have those two kinds of categories of plants, real and artificial. And then we have a series of, we call them novel artifacts. And these are objects that we make that are matched to shape and color features of the plants. And this is where baby science is also fun because you get to do a lot of crafting. Like every baby lab has like a glue gun and like these crazy shelves full of all kinds of wonderful stuff. And so we make these objects where we do things like you take the same kind of leaves that are used in our artificial plants, but pull them off and then put them around, in a different configuration around like a tube, a cardboard tube or something, so that the leaf shape is there, but it's presented in a different configuration. And we usually color the leaves something else, so like purple or black, something you wouldn't see usually, like a really artificial purple, something you wouldn't see in nature. Or we construct these other green things that share the same green color as the plant. They have these little tendrily things on them, but they are not plants. They're made from plastic and beads, and they're very obviously not plants. But it allows us to control for the overall shape of the plants that we have, the individual kinds of features, the color, to see if babies are responding to those kinds of things, shape, color, features. The next category we use are familiar objects, because the artificial objects that the novel artifacts that we use are obviously things babies have never seen before, because we make them special in our lab. And so we want to look to see if there's something that, so we want to be able to compare, our babies just responding to something they have seen a version of before, i.e. a plant, compared to these crazy objects that we made that they've never seen before. So we have these, everyday familiar objects, which we've tested: lamps, wooden spoons, pots, books, shovels, like all kinds of different objects that babies would see before. And in that category, in some studies, we've also included other dangerous objects. So we've had things like sharp-looking knives that we present to babies. And of course, again, for IRB reasons, these are 3D printed knives. They're not actually real knives, but we have those kinds of objects. And then the final category we use are these other naturally occurring objects. So stuff like shells and stones, and like natural sea sponges, things that occur out in nature that they're not made by humans, to see whether babies maybe are responding to kind of this broader category of naturally occurring versus human made. And so when we present all of those objects, and we do that again, the baby is seated on the parent's lap, parent's eyes are closed, and then the experimenter puts the objects down one at a time in front of the baby in a randomized order, so that different babies see different orders, and you just put these things down one at a time, wait for a set amount of time, and see if the babies reach out and touch or not. And then if they touch, we go back through and look at the videos and code how long it actually takes them to do that. So it's a long setup for basically saying what we find is evidence that babies in this setup take significantly longer to reach out and touch plants versus all of the other kinds of objects that we test. So they take a long time to touch real plants. They take a long time to touch artificial plants. We don't tend to see differences between those categories, but they will, in contrast, really quickly touch the novel artifacts that share the shape and color features of the plants. They will really quickly touch the familiar objects, the other familiar objects, and they will really quickly touch the other naturally occurring objects. And we've seen this over and over and over again. We've tested this in the US, we've tested it here in Germany, and we have also been fortunate enough to collaborate with some anthropologists who work with Indigenous communities, and we've tested this in two different Indigenous societies, one in Ecuador in the Amazon basin and one in Fiji. And we've seen that infants in those societies too show evidence of this same kind of reluctance. It's a little bit different in those. There's some interesting differences in those places, which we can talk about, but where we have tested this so far, we have seen evidence of this. And that's in this very, in this very safe setting where the infants are being handed these objects essentially by a nice person who has gone out of their way to make sure that the baby knows that they're not threatening, and they're seated right there on their parents' lap. And even still, we see that they take longer to reach out and touch.
So obviously, what you can conclude from just a casual reading or hearing of this is that something is going on in the infant's brain cognitively, whether it's discrimination, whether it's some type of something that they've gotten cues before, some learning. So what do you think? So two questions to this. What do you think is going on in the brain for the child or for the infant? And I am curious a little bit of what it does look, how it does look different in the four places you named: Ecuador, mm-hmm. Fiji, Germany, US.
Yep, that's right. So, I can just start by just how it looks different in the different places. So the US and German infants, the pattern looks really similar. So okay. There's not in the weird places. Yeah, exactly. In the weird places, the pattern looks similar. Right. In the Indigenous society in Ecuador, we tested this among the Shuar. I did this in collaboration with Clark Barrett at UCLA. What we found there is that the Shuar infants were reluctant to touch both real and artificial plants. And in fact, we actually had we had some different categories. So what we did for the Schwarr, for the Schwarr, let me just back up. So we tested this with an indigenous community with the Schwarr, and we did the experiment a little bit differently because there are a few things. Anytime you go to a different culture, you have to adapt things a little bit. And so there are a few things that are problematic in trying to do developmental research in some of these in indigenous communities. In some of these indigenous communities, mainly, like, there's just not a lot of babies, because these are small scale societies. And so what that means is that my collaborators who went and actually tested it in these places, because they have these long-standing relationships working with these communities, they just test everybody under the age of 3, right? So it's a much broader age range because there's just not babies, or there's not a lot of babies. And then we also have to do kind of slight adaptations to the procedure because you're not testing in a lab anymore. You're like out in people's homes testing this, or you're at like a community center or something like that. And it's a different thing. But what we found is that for the Shuar, the indigenous community in Ecuador in the Amazon basin, they were really reluctant to touch plants, both real plants and artificial plants. They were reluctant to touch domesticated plants. So we had the real plants that the Shuar practice small scale horticulture. And so they have plants that they're growing right outside their homes. And so our logic was that the infants would be super familiar with those plants. And so we had the domestic plants that they would be super familiar with. And then we had wild plants, which were the plants that were just from out in the jungle that our collaborators would pick. And then the Shuar kids were reluctant to touch all of those. So it didn't matter whether they were plants that they would regularly encounter versus plants that they would infrequently encounter, if they encountered them at all, versus these completely novel plants that were the artificial ones that my collaborators took down with them. We also saw that the Shuar were reluctant to touch these novel objects too, just because these things are very, very, very different than the kinds of things that they would see.
Well, I was just going to ask, I wonder if some of that is the setting. So obviously in a laboratory, there's some things that are just kind of, and also for quote unquote Western conditions. But, I wonder if there's some element of it in the setting where you have to be more risk adverse and more observant of threats when you're living in the natural elements. I've been to the Amazon in Ecuador, and it's pretty it's untouched in many ways.
Yes.
And you get this feeling of you have to be it's absolutely gorgeous, but you have to be on your guard for everything.
Yeah.
Is that plant going to, whatever should I step under that rock? Should I step in that stream? You're thinking about, bugs and little critters, mosquitoes. You have to think about other animals. You have to think about, there's just so many, it's very untouched. So it's just, you don't have a lot. So I wonder if, this is my guess. I wonder if that's, maybe some of it, maybe not. That's much different than being in a room, sitting on your parents' lap, in some ways. But I don't know. What were your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it is as you say, it's a very different environment in which to grow up. It's a very, very different environment, and that's what makes it such an interesting environment. It makes it interesting to see what these children do compared to the kids in the U.S. and in Germany. And so, my collaborators who tested this, they did a fantastic job of keeping the actual testing conditions, as close as humanly possible to what we did. So they did actually have the baby seated on the parent's lap, and they put the things across the table, and they used the same kind of stimuli. we of course talked about anytime you do any kind of cross-cultural study, you have to always walk a fine line between having comparability to the original study that you've done, likely in a weird, quote unquote, weird culture, versus that. So that's one side. And then the other side, though, is that the kinds of things you use in the quote unquote weird culture can be really different, such that they come across as a different category of thing. So I think that is what was going on with these novel artifacts that we had. I think that's certainly what's going on there. They're just such a different kind of thing. But we in order to be sure about that, we would have to do more studies, and we have not gotten that far yet.
Was that how it was? Was it similar in Fiji as well with the indigenous peoples?
Yeah. So this is the thing. So the pattern with the Shuar in Ecuador is that they are reluctant to touch all plants, these novel object things, compared to the familiar objects and the other naturally occurring objects. So we see basically with respect to plants. We see a clear reluctance to touch plants, even from these kids who grow up, just immersed in a natural environment. And as you rightly point out, it's kind of an unforgiving environment in a lot of ways.
Well, for many indigenous peoples or tribes in the Amazon basin, I mean, that's home for them. So that's all they know. That's home, and they've been there for thousands of years. But even still,
yes,
just on, starting at, from the same place, you have obviously learned that it's familiar to do that, but you still have to do that. You have to be very, very aware of it. And of course, over time in your environment, you develop heuristics and shortcuts and all this stuff. But yeah, for me as an outsider going there and being like, oh my goodness, it was also like, you have to just kind of be very aware of things. So obviously familiar for them, less familiar for me, obviously, but you still have to have an awareness. I mean, I don't think that really changes the awareness.
No, exactly. And the kinds of things that you're doing in your day-to-day, just walking around the world, locomoting around the world, it's a very different set of things you have to pay attention to. And it's a very different set of plants and animals that you encounter than you would encounter walking down the street as a toddler in Berlin, for example. I mean, like that
Right.
is,
Right.
it's really different.
Right.
The mistakes you can make specifically with respect to plants when you're living in that kind of environment versus when you're living in Berlin. And that's what I mean by it's a bit more unforgiving, right? You can make, I think you're more, of course you can make a terrible mistake with respect to plants in Berlin, that can happen. But you're probably less likely to encounter that situation in a day-to-day kind of way. But the Shuar pattern is interesting because it does show still the same kind of overall thing where the US and the German babies are reluctant to touch kind of all the plants we've tested with them. The Shuar infants and young children are also reluctant to touch all the plants we've tested with them. In Fiji, it's a different story. So in Fiji, what we saw is that it was only the unfamiliar plants. So these strange plants that we brought in that they hadn't seen before, that the kids were reluctant to touch. They were fine with touching the plants that they had seen before, the kind of real plants that were from their environment. And this is an indigenous society, the Aitaukai Fijians. They are of the people in that who are living in that society have the kind of knowledge that you build up with respect to what the natural world can do is just incredibly rich. It's not like the kind of knowledge you build up is incredibly rich, but it's not the same kind of ecological environment as being in the jungle, right? You're more like people are living in more open environments, marine environments, beach environments. This is not the same thing as living in the middle of the jungle. So at the same time, too, we don't know what causes these differences. So, of course, in thinking about plants, I'm thinking about, well, there's the plant life in the jungle is different than the plant life that is being encountered in the jungle in Ecuador is different than the plant life that's being encountered near the beaches in Fiji. But at the same time, it could be that there are other things going on, that there's different kinds of like social patterns, there's different kinds of cultural information, cultural context. There's obviously a lot of differences between these different places. Even between the US and Germany, there's a lot of differences. And so what we can, I think the most we can say from the findings so far is that we do see evidence of this reluctance to touch these unfamiliar plants in all of the societies that we've tested so far. But we do see these interesting differences, and it suggests that there are factors that are differing across these societies that are calibrating children, infants and young children, even at these very young ages, with how they're responding to the environment. But we don't know what those are yet. Right. These are the first studies. I can speculate about them. I have ideas about them. But they're all things that need to be tested because we just simply don't know. But it's fascinating, and it falls out of this logic of these things should be these social learning, that the cognitive systems for learning about plants or for dealing with plants should be these learning systems that do allow you to adapt to local conditions. Right. So the idea is kind of like, it's like sort of the same ideas with language is everybody to a first approximation kind of comes equipped with the same language learning software, the same language learning cognitive architecture. But the language that you learn will depend on the language community in which you grow up. And I think of the kind of, plant learning systems in the same way where by hypothesis, everybody to a first approximation comes into the world with the same kind of basic architecture, but the kind of knowledge that you build up about the plants in your environment will really heavily, and how including how you interact with them, how dangerous you think, kind of you're calibrated for plants being, all of that should be sensitive to what the local conditions are. And that's kind of the power of these kinds of evolved systems, is that they do allow humans to flexibly adapt to many different kinds of environments. And they've really contributed to the success of our species, that we're able to live in all of these really different places. So I mean, the thing that is exciting to me about this work is that it's, as I was hesitating saying like nobody was doing it before me, because of course people were doing work that touches on this, but the specific kinds of things I'm looking at, people just hadn't tested. And so that's exciting because it means there's a lot that I'm discovering that's new, but it's also a little bit frustrating because we're still in the early stages and I don't have good, clear answers for why yet. I'm working on it.
Yeah, no, I mean, you certainly are. It's just fascinating research. I guess my last question for you is, what is the, this is a hard thing to ask, I guess, because it seems very absolute or whatever. And I know everything's sort of relative here, but what would you say is the optimal or ideal relationship humans should have with plant life, right? How can we be more aware of our environments, respective environments? Of course, that's going to be different in different places on the planet. But how do we have an ethic or an ethical type of interaction with certain environments, right? And especially for with the work you're doing on infants, what is the space and where we can minimize the error part of the trial and error, right? So if they're trying to learn things about their environment, how can they learn things in a way that's productive and healthy and a good dynamic and for them to be safe, but also where, they're not taking berries and put them in their mouth and then they're getting sick or whatever. Obviously there is a lot of this internal architecture, but I guess just the more we know and the more we understand from the research, what are these kind of implications for understanding it going forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that one of the kind of broad summary from all of the work that I've done, including some of the studies we didn't get to talk too much in detail about, but basically what my work shows is that before infants and young children have clear information about a particular kind of plant, the default response seems to be to avoid it. So to not really engage with it. But at the same time, what they do is they seem to be seeking out social information from other people. So during that avoidance, they actually seem to look to the adults around them. And they do that. What our data show is they do that more often when they're confronted with plants than with other things. And so it's this initial avoidance coupled with a search for information. And then we have evidence that they rapidly and selectively learn, for example, that certain plants can be edible. And that they extend this information in precise ways. And I think that what the research suggests is that, there's sort of a part of our human nature that is set up to be wary about engaging with nature and specifically engaging with plant life without the kind of proper social support. Right. So if you're kind of set up to either, I don't think infants are scared of plants, but I think they're just not interested in them unless they get social signals from other people. And I think that there's also some suggestion. We have some work suggesting that that aversion to eating healthy foods like fruits and vegetables works much the same way. And this is something that other people have studied. So, so aversion of bitter tastes is one of these other mechanisms for avoiding plant toxins that's been studied. And of course, many vegetables are bitter. But this kind of thing you see with toddlers or with young children where they all of a sudden reject fruits and vegetables, it's called food neophobia, seems to have a similar kind of pattern of what we've seen with this avoidance of plants or initial reluctance to touch plants. So you have all of these protective things set up to it's too strong to say remove children from plants, but to just protect them from the kind of danger that can be there. But at the same time, because we now live in these societies where we don't go out and pick our food from farms or certainly not from wild environments for most of us. We don't anymore live in a community of people who has a really rich ecological knowledge about the natural world around us. We're really missing these fundamental, likely expected aspects of human existence that would help us to engage with nature, to eat a healthier diet, to maybe, it is almost certainly too strong to say to care about nature more, but maybe also to care about nature more, to understand the world around us. And that can help. You can imagine that could help engage us as a society in being invested in protecting the natural world as we face, these massive changes due to climate change and habitat loss and all of these things that are going on. And so I think that I hope anyway that my work can highlight that we need to think about how could we replace some of what we've lost. It's not missing in all societies. It's disappearing in a lot of places, but how could we replace what we've lost? How could we create environments for kids where they are learning where their food comes from, right? And they are getting the kind of that kind of engagement, that kind of social information that would really potentially have a huge impact on them.
Yeah, no, I think that's particularly instructive, and especially in development. And also, how do you develop in a world that's changing with, we're not hunter-gatherers exclusively anymore, obviously, and so a very changing world and in different places and with, different environments and settings. Well, look, Annie. This has been so much fun. I find your work deeply fascinating, and it is really, really, really awesome to have you on here and telling us all about your work. And I mean, I could really talk to you for hours and listen to you talk about all your work. It's really, really, I find it really, really fascinating, exciting stuff. And so, and the good news is that there's so much more to do, which I'm sure you'll be doing. So, where can people find your work and find you? Where are all the relevant places?
Yeah, so right now you can, I'm working at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development in Berlin. So we have a website that is for the MPIB Baby Lab. And then I also have a Twitter handle, which is just my name, Annie Wertz. And between those two places, that's the best place to look. My group here at the Max Planck system is a fantastic thing to be involved in, but almost all contracts are temporary. So my time at the Max Planck is coming to an end relatively soon. And so if you just search my name wherever I land next, you will be able to find me.
No, that's great. Well, thank you, Annie, for giving me your time and all of your energy and knowledge. I had such a lovely time talking with you. So big thanks.
Yeah, thank you. This was a real pleasure. Thanks for the invitation. This is really fun to talk to you too, and I just really appreciate it.
Of course, yeah. Thank you.